Hello again. So this is, we're looking at the questions relating to week 3, where we focused, as you know, on landscape methods and the hinterland of Portus. Behind us, as usual, nice image, and today it's the Torlonia, the cast of the Torlonia relief. So is there anything you want to say about it?
Well, it's actually one of my favourite pieces of sculpture. It's a beautiful relief. And for me, the importance of this is, in many ways, it just symbolises a whole range of activities that went on at the port, ranging from ships coming in, ships anchoring, presence of triumphal arch, perhaps the imperial presence, warehouses, and the presence of sculptures to deities representing the religious activities happening there too. So it's a very, very special piece of sculpture.
Marvellous. Okay, so we'll start, as usual, with what was the hardest question this week. And the question was, what was the most significant economic activity in the hinterland of Portus? And the answer was salt production. But I realised that we don't actually talk very much about salt production. So can you just briefly say, how was the salt, there's the Campus Salinarum Romanorum. So how was salt extracted there, or what activities happened there?
Well, I think you just have to remember that the Portus is situated in an estuarine landscape. It's a delta landscape, and you've got large internal lagoons, which lend themselves perfectly to salt production. And so those are the basis for creating a whole series of land divisions and sort of salt beds where this stuff could be dried out and then systematically packaged up and taken along the Via Campana right up to Rome. And this starts in the 2nd century BC, 200 plus years before Portus is established, and seems to carry on certainly right the way through the 2nd and the 3rd centuries AD. So a really important element in the economy of the hinterland of Rome, probably not actually having an awful lot to do with Portus itself, as far as we know, although I guess it's possible that salt could have been exported, but we don't know. We have no way of knowing.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so now we'll go to the questions as ever in reverse order by most light. So the first one, this is fascinating. So we know that there was lots of underground tunnels and drainage infrastructure in Rome. Okay, so presumably lots of stuff was pumped out from Rome that went into the Tiber of various kinds. And in this week we've been talking a lot about landscapes, and that includes sedimentation and so on and so forth. Is there a chance that the processes that were happening in Rome, so the amazing drainage infrastructure, would have influenced the silting up and the need to dredge the harbours at Portus?
Probably not. I mean, clearly all that stuff is going out through the drainage system into the Tiber and heading out into the Tyrrhenian Sea. But on the other hand, the canal system linked to the Tiber did play a role in trying to alleviate flooding of the Tiber. And this was a perennial problem, and the emperors tried various measures at alleviating this. And the Claudian port was created with the simultaneous objective of relieving the Tiber backing up and flooding Rome further upriver. Again, one understands from Pliny that Trajan tried to do the same with one of his canals. But we know in the end, from the fact that the excavation of the aqueduct and the road leading from Portus to Rome was continually flooded, we know clearly that this probably wasn't very successful. In fact, they never probably resolved the question. So you have to imagine that looking at in Portus in antiquity, now we tend to see it surrounded by land, salt pans and whatever. But you have to imagine probably in antiquity it could have been almost like an island of 3 basins surrounded by concrete structures, surrounded by more water generated by floods.
Okay, Brill, thank you. Okay, so the next question harks back to an issue we were discussing in the week 1 roundup, where we were at, if you remember, the Capo Due Rami, and you talked about how that was a very complicated, busy place.
Yeah.
Now the whole canal system was extremely complicated. So was there, or in here at Portus, or anywhere else evidence for a pilot system or something that helped visitors navigate their way around the harbour system?
No, we have virtually no evidence, although I'm firmly of the mind that there must have been some kind of system,
Mm-hmm.
because moving traffic around there unregulated would have created absolute chaos.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I can suggest is that there was a system of signalling stations up the Tiber to
Mm-hmm.
Rome, which would have at least provided authorities at Portus with an idea of which boats were coming at what time,
Mm-hmm.
and the same thing going back up to the city. And then within Portus itself there must have been a series of, I guess, flags for signalling movement at different times.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we just don't have the evidence because virtually none of the canals have been excavated. We just don't know.
Okay, well, something we do know very, very, very physically is that in studying the Seven Magazzini, in looking at the layout, we can see there's quite a distinctive use of very narrow passageways in some parts of the building. Now, is it possible that those were used for regulating movement, perhaps from one side of the building to another? I mean, the discussion about maybe taxes or fees of some kind being regulated because it was just physically difficult to move stuff from one side of the building to the other.
Probably not inside the Severa Magazzini. I think that we tend to have a series of vaulted rooms opening onto fairly narrow passages on 2 or 3 stories with ramps going up. And I think I think you can explain that in terms of moving stuff around, whether it's grain or whether it's archives and records, we don't really know. On the other hand, around the inside of the hexagonal basin, you do have this famous, what's called the contramura interna, which is a wall with, every 75 metres, these very narrow entrances. And I think those were deliberately intended to restrict the flow of people, and indeed who were unloading from ships and moving to warehouses. And indeed the warehouses themselves, very, very big, loads of storage rooms, but one tiny door. And again, I think the aim is to try and regulate the movement of what goes in, what comes out, and that's because the state is trying to make sure that everything that turns up in a ship is checked off when it comes, it's unloaded, it's then checked off again when it's taken to the warehouse, and it's then checked off when it's stored, and then the whole procedure is repeated when things come out again. So it's all about the state trying to regulate those cargoes that were key to its own interests.
Okay. Okay, so we'll move on to some more flouting of regulations, though.
Okay.
So some of you liked the magic minibus ride that we took part in this week.
It was different.
It was, yes. You escaped with your life in town. So there was a comment raised very sensibly that the magic minibus ride took us around the Claudian Basin and still ended up on the Claudian Basin. As if you remember, we moved around to the north. Around the Terrazzo Tirano, and then around the north of the Imperial Palace, and then sort of stop there.
Yeah.
So the point that was made is: did ships in the Claudian and Trajanic period and Severan still dock in the Claudian Basin? And were there some there and other ones in the Trajanic Basin, and would it have been different ships in each of the different locations?
Again, we have very little evidence, but I think there are ways to try and answer that question by looking at basin depths, accessibility, and issues of that kind. On that basis, my view is that the Claudian Basin is primarily about ships anchoring towards the centre of it and waiting till the space becomes freed up in the Trajanic Basin. There's a little bit of evidence that there's clearly some kind of unloading on the eastern side of the Claudian Basin in the area known as Monte Giulio. But I think we can see these seagoing ships coming in, anchoring there, and maybe offloading small bits of cargo with lighters. When their bay is free, they then come down the Canale di Imbocca al Porto di Traiano. They then take their sails down, and they're properly towed in, because it's a very narrow entrance.
Yep.
They're then towed in, they come in, and they then see these mooring rings, and they see these columns with numbers on, so they know where they've got to go. And then they head to the centre of the basin and they wait until their bay is free. And quite often they could be towed in with smaller ships, smaller boats, lighters again, or it's indeed possible that some of them might not have docked, and their cargo would have been completely unloaded by lighters. So there's a very complex series of things going on there, and I'm just kind of guessing as to how this might have worked on the evidence that we have.
Okay. Thinking about a much broader scale, there's a question raised about the fact that in the later 2nd century there were armies, the Roman armies all over the place, everywhere you can imagine. And what role, if any, did porters play in controlling movement of food and other supplies that were required by the army, or was that predominantly a terrestrial movement?
I think the simple answer to that is probably very little.
Right.
There are ships and soldiers from the Mycenaean fleet at Portus, as we know, but I think their function is more to do with security at the port, the movement of the emperor, maybe the movement of officials and governors to provinces and so forth and so on. Those cases where we do have supplies going out to the east, for example, they tend to go out from the port of Ancona on the Adriatic coast, not Portus. Otherwise, I think a lot of goods supplied by and needed by the army for supplies would go by land or river rather than by sea. Because, of course, at that time, the Western Mediterranean, there really wasn't much in the way of a heavy military presence, apart from North Africa, but that was sort of self-supply.
Okay. Another quick one. So you made brief mention of the Antonine plague. Is there any evidence either at Portus or Ostia to indicate the impact of that on those communities?
No, we have absolutely nothing.
Okay, that's a very simple one.
There's a good reason for it, of course.
Okay, yeah.
And that's because it's a historically documented plague.
Yeah.
But the archaeological challenge is how do you recognise plague in the archaeological record, and it's not an easy one to answer.
Okay, so the last one, which harks back to what we were discussing in the week 1 roundup of questions. So, with respect to the Statio Marmorum, do we have any evidence in the Roman world about how you move these massive pieces of marble around? And then the follow-up bit is, I think I mentioned in a video the fact that there is evidence of columns and other marble materials in the canal itself.
Yes.
But I didn't talk at all about how we know that. So I just want to quickly ask you.
Well, yes. Starting with the latter part of the question, there is evidence for large chunks of marble and columns and so on in the Fossa Traiana, certainly, and I would guess too the Tiber. The evidence from the Fossa Traiana comes from multi-beam survey, which was undertaken by the University of Rome some years ago now, and you can really see some of these big chunks lying at the bottom of the canal. And one imagines that they're the mistakes. Those are the ships that kind of got overloaded and their cargo tipped into the Tiber, very much the contractor's ire. But one imagines that these are carried up on very large barges and they're just floated up the Tiber along with everything else. There's no evidence as yet, I think, for marble ships per se. They're just marble, I think, forms a principal cargo on very, very large sea-going ships.
Marvellous, thank you. Yeah, so it just reminded me, many years ago I worked in Egypt at a site called Meos Hormos near to Mons Claudianus, and there was a fantastic, a huge column, perhaps, I don't know, 40 metres long, a couple of metres wide, just lying there, broken, probably ready to be shipped or dragged first and then shipped to Portus. So I think I find it still extraordinary when I'm in Italy that I have also a physical connection to the material that we found in Roman sites in Egypt. Anyway, so from 2 hot places and another hot place in the studio, thank you very much for today.
Yeah, thank you.